Thanks very much to TAAI for the invitation to give this lecture. I like giving lectures like this because it makes me think things through in a different way. I work 1 day a week for FCDO at the moment. I'm a senior research fellow. I have to say at the start, I'm an advisor, so nothing you hear from me has any weight in terms of FCDO. Don't get excited that you're going to get any inside secrets from that, because I'm not allowed to, I'm not a spokesperson for that. But what I have learned in going back into FCDO, having sort of, as Margaret described, I've sort of been in and out of development a number of times, and it gives you a different perspective, I think. I've also been involved in doing research, then in managing research, then in advising research on research. And what was interesting, what did I, it's got a slow reaction. There we are. Right, so when I was asked to give the Ralph Melville Lecture, there was a little blurb in the invitation that explained a bit about it, and I was quite intrigued that actually we have some things in common. So one of the things we have in common is we're both graduates of Edinburgh University. Don't know if there's anyone else in the room that can say that as well. Ralph Melville graduated in zoology. He then went out to Kenya and he did some research, then like me. So we both did a bit of research. Then we became managers of research institutes. He was manager of a coffee research institute. I was manager of a land use research institute. And then he went on to advise into government. So we share those things in common. And I think I had already chosen the subject before I was looking a lot into that. But I think the subject is appropriate because in one of the obituaries to Ralph Melville, the final sentence summing him up was it was interested in relevance and practicality. And I like to think that that's why I went into research. I did an agriculture degree so that I could help feed the world, which was what we were trying to do at that point in time. And actually, I moved across to NRI. At the time, I realized I was actually contributing to milk lakes and butter mountains. I thought that wasn't actually particularly relevant. I was wanting to feed the world. So that's what we had in common. And what I thought, therefore, in terms of starting off with this, I do a bit of scene setting about how the UK government funds research. As Mark said, I started off in a research council. It was actually the Agriculture Research Council at the time. And I've also been funded by government departments. And as I go through this, I think you see, I grew up in Scotland, I'm back in Scotland, and do quite a bit of Scottish country dancing. And in Scottish country dancing, people come together and go apart. So come together and go apart. And as I go through the history, I think you'll see that actually the research councils and government departments have come together, or apart, come together, or apart in terms of what they're funding. And my colleague, Clevin Thomas, who's here tonight, when I first started with the Research Council, Cled had just come back not that long before, working for ODA in Kenya. And at that time, there was a relationship between the two that you could do that. You could move from one to the other. And as you've heard, I went on secondment from the Research Council to work in the Caribbean for a year. So there was actually quite a bit of interaction. That was back in the 70s, early 80s. This is a bit, sorry, this is confusing because the screen doesn't move, so I have to, what's happening here? Anyway, so I think we've all heard of the Haldane principle, which goes back to 1918. And basically, that was making it clear that research in the Research Council should be free from political interference. There is pressures, but let's call it that it should be separate. And when I was looking into that, I came across a really interesting paper written by Miles Parker. Anyone here knows Miles? But he worked in the DEFRA office of the Chief Science Advisor for DEFRA for quite a while, and I came across him quite a lot towards the end of both our careers at that time. But Miles wrote a sort of a history of what had happened to research funding in DEFRA over the years, and that set me down this path. So Rothschild. When I started, the Rothschild report was very much referred to, and looking at what Miles wrote, so Rothschild actually took money out of the research councils and put it into what it should be more about applied science. Miles is quite blunt, actually, in terms of what he says about Rothschild. Rothschild had no experience of research. He'd been in industry, and he very much believed in this customer-contractor relationship that should actually be how government funded things. And so he took, I found these figures quite surprising, he took 77% out of ARC, for example. So he took those out, and as you see from the quote from his paper, the paper was published in Nature in 2016, and basically what we see there is that was a big change in terms of what actually happens in government departments. Now, remember, he's talking mainly about deference, not at this point about ODA as it was at the time. But he is basically saying, and then he was saying that, so it's about customer contractor. Who is actually the customer of this research? And when I started at NRI, I was sent, because I spent some time overseas, but my boss thought that my first trip should be overseas, 3 weeks in Africa with an economist. So there we are, we get to Heathrow, and the economist turned to me and he said, I don't know why they appointed you. All the biological science has been done. All we need now is social science, economists and social scientists. So it was a very interesting introduction to what was going to be my new career in NRI. And just before I left where I was before in the Grassland Research Institute, I met an eminent scientist, and he said to me, "You're moving to work for the government." Yes. That's the end of your career. So it wasn't a very good start in terms of what I might be able to contribute. But I put in this slide, this picture, because the economist basically said, go and talk to farmers. They're the customer. And to some extent, he was right. This is a photo from Nepal, when I was visiting Bombay Research Station. We're talking to, I thought, here I am, I'm a nutritionist, I have a reputation, I can feed animals, I've contributed to milk pigs, etc., etc. And so when I was asked what sort of feed would these tree leaves be good for the animals in Nepal, well, we need to get the fibre down a bit. Talking to the farmers, they wanted high fibre in tree leaves because they were the feed in the dry season. And if they didn't have full bellies, the animals made a lot of noise. So therefore, they wanted high fibre, keep the animals quiet. And that was a good lesson in understand the context, understand what your customers' priorities are. Anyway, so that was where we were when I started in NRM. So how many people remember the yellow brick? Unfortunately, I threw mine out, actually, some years ago. But I was very involved in the RNRRS, Renewable Natural Resources Research Strategy. And it was, I think, a 10-year set of programs that were set up. And initially, I managed the livestock production one. But when NRI was privatized, I had oversight of these 5 programs. And they were very much set up to, again, all about production. We're trying to increase production. But then what happened? And if you remember, 1997, Blair government came in, Claire Short took over, came DFID at that point in time. Claire Short decided that the objective was about poverty reduction. I remember spending a lot of time trying to write reports of what research we had commissioned in the previous 5 years or whatever it was that had been commissioned for production, and we had to say what had they delivered in terms of poverty reduction. What that was, but working for government, I was talking to Elizabeth earlier, you civil servant, you just learned to go with the flow and to move. So that was the yellow brick. And then, oh yeah, sorry, but we were thinking about poverty, and I wanted to just show this example from China to say another point. So I was fortunate enough to go to visit China, to go to a workshop on urea treatment of straw, which was a big thing in the UK, but it became huge in China. We're talking about scaling up. It happened very fast. And China got out of poverty. And why? Because of the politics. Because the government could just go, like this gentleman, very dressed up for being a farmer, but he was told by the government what to do, and he was told to treat his straw with urea. So if you want scaling up, that's when the politics actually came into it. So moving on then from the yellow brick, the RNRS, when that came to an end, there was, by this time I'd left DFID at the time, so taking this from quotes, but the research into use program came up. And the point that I've highlighted there is something that I think really makes us think. Hundreds of tried and tested technologies, hundreds of papers that were out there. And that goes back to my economics colleague, who basically said, we know it all, we just got to get it adopted. I'll come back to that later. That might have been true then, but it's certainly not true now. But also, if you look at the two objectives of research into use, particularly the second one, it was also very much moving on to understanding, promotion, and the use of outputs contributing to, and we've moved a bit here, haven't we? So we're not just reducing poverty, but we're also boosting economic growth, which is something that you know is very close to the current government. And that's not giving anything away, because that's in the public domain, just to reassure. So, research into use. What happened next? Well, actually, about the same time, and this is back to the dancing analogy. So research into use, I think, started about 2005-06 at the end of the RNRS. But DFID and BPSRC are then coming together again. And they jointly agreed to fund SARID. I can't remember the acronym, but it was basically about crops. It was a 4-year program. And basically it was trying to get that join up again between the strategic upstream down to the actual impact in the field. And it was also, that was the time of the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and trying to, but it was also about productive partnerships between scientists in the UK and in developing countries. And we'll come back to partnerships later. So I was asked, by then, as I said, I was out of DFID, and I was asked to do an evaluation of SARID, together with a colleague who was an experienced evaluator. And despite the fact that it was set up to impact to some extent, but we were obviously, this is a quote from our report, basically saying there had been some developmental impact. And actually, what happened with SARID, which was very pleasing, was actually some of the projects that were funded in SARID actually they had actually started originally in the crop protection program in the 90s. So the research scientists had been clever enough to be able to twist what they were saying, the objectives of what they were doing to get that continuity, which government was not actually giving. So it was, as you see, so I sort of spelled that out here, science projects. But it wasn't just those, it wasn't just that they were building that knowledge, it was also that there was a trust formed between previous partnership. And that was carrying on. Okay, so after SARIT, what came next? So, Global Challenge Research Funding, GCRF. How many people were involved in that? But it was very much led by the research councils. By then, I was back sort of in the research council sphere, and I got quite involved because I had experience in LMICs. And so I got involved in some of the decision making and choices of projects, etc. They had 3 themes, and you start to see sustainable, it's not growth there, sustainable economies and societies, resilient food systems, etc. And when I talk to people now from UK universities and institutes, they're still very fond of GCIAR. But what happened? Was political decision, and GCRF funding was cut. I can't remember, something like 60% in a one-off, and some of them were sort of allowed to go on to the end, but huge cut. So again, setting something up, but not keeping it going. And what we learned from SARIT is that long-term funding that you need if you're wanting to have impact. So nowadays, we tend to talk more about scaling. I remember back in the 90s, we talked more about outcomes. Remember log frames? Theories of change, they're still going. I particularly liked the 3 spheres that came from IDRC. Show that in there. And now it's sort of pathways to impact. But actually, I quite like scaling. And at the moment, I'm working with colleagues in CGIAR and trying to, what is it about scaling? So it's very good having to prepare this lecture to see what I've learned about that. Just the IDRC, the Canadian Development Organization, they used this sphere, 3-sphere system to show sphere of control is what researchers had control over. Sphere of influence was then your users. So that was the output phase. So where would that go to? And the sphere of interest were the eventual outcomes that you want. Well, that's a long way from research because but sphere of interest was a good way of explaining it because it meant you had to think about the context in which your final outcome was actually going to come. So I talked a bit about all these chopping and changing, but I also want to show the positive side of this and also make us think about what you measure for him. So I give 1 lecture a year to justify my emeritus position at the University of Aberdeen. And it's to a bunch of students across the university from many disciplines. And one of the things I say is basically research, look what research has contributed to. You think between 67 and 23, I think the population doubled in the world. And at the same time, so this is per person energy consumption. This is how much is available. So there is plenty food around to feed, plenty energy around to actually feed everyone. And that only came about through all that research. But if you take one project and you look at what impact did that have, where does it take you? Let's start thinking about what are we looking for in terms of impact from individual projects, or are we looking at from programs? Are we looking at over a longer scale? What can we learn about that? So the CGIAR, I'm sure is known to a lot of you here, not all, and basically they have, as Mark said, I was chairing the ISPC for the time in the 2010s, and part of that was SPIA, the Standing Panel on Impact Assessment. And SPIA did a lot of work on CGIAR impact. And actually, if you look at the impact of crop research, it's huge. I was very disappointed that when they did it for livestock and dairy, you couldn't really detect a lot. I don't think that's necessarily, again, it comes back to how do you measure impact and what, because I think there are a lot of benefits that came from livestock research. But there, you can see that was just over a 2-year period. And you also start to see them coming in, and been seen in SARID, etc., coming in as changes to government and organisation policies. So you're starting to see a recognition that it's not just about the technologies out in the field, but it's also about that enabling environment in order to get the impact on scaling. And interestingly, although we changed government 2 years ago, and this government was also very keen to look at economic growth, as I mentioned before, economic growth within the UK. And so my colleague Alan Tollervey, on to a few of you, commissioned this study on what was the benefit to the UK of CGIAR research. And this picked up on wheat. And so showing that 65% of the wheat grown in the UK can be traced back to CGIAR, back to CIMMET. That's the institute that was doing the breeding on that. And UK farmers, it showed how we have benefited. And that was never the original intention of the CGIAR. So again, it's sort of these objectives as to different types of objectives and how they come together. And also how you respond when you get government changes in what they're wanting to show benefits of these different research. Now, I've also been thinking about, so what has been moving both in the UK and in LMICs away from thinking about agriculture per se, but thinking about food products. And so the scaling, if you think about the scaling, it has to be in the 70s, 80s, 90s. In the UK, we were about increasing productivity. But if you're wanting to make money, economic growth, then you have to have a market. And the one that's always intrigued me in the UK about a food that did scale up quite fast was actually yogurt. I went to the Highland Show in the late 60s, I think, or maybe early 70s, and they had this thing, fermented food, yogurt. That was never going to take off because it'd been produced by bacteria. We're not going to eat bacteria, were we? So, but it took off. And you can see the scaling up that went on there, the time scale. Also, when you look into the analysis, looking at papers and saying, so what was that successful? And this came from a business person, that the scaling was down to, success was down to technical know-how, good logistics, and investment in marketing. Well, we can't just take those because there was technical know-how, good logistics, and investment in marketing for GMO, but that didn't take off in the same way. Simply, the marketing wasn't quite on message in terms of that. So that was an example from UK. But sorry, one other thing about yogurt. Yogurt has, of course, been eaten consumed for, millennia probably in many other countries. There was a lot of knowledge out there in other countries about yogurt and fermented foods in general. This is another one that's been a success story. Orange flesh sweet potato. I gather in the 2000s there was actually someone that used to dress up as an orange flesh sweet potato around DFID at the time that's still referred to. But that was an innovative idea. 1991. Again, a lot of money went into that in the CGIAR to actually breed it, to develop it, and there the success of the scaling was put to adapted, well-performing, and they were preferred by consumers. So we're now broadening our users. Going back to the 90s, I was told to talk to farmers. Here, we're moving on to talking not just to farmers as the users, but also looking at that broader enabling environment who's going to buy it, and also about governments and what are they going to do. Orange plus sweet potato, it's got a vitamin in it. So it's a healthy thing. For some reason, pressing the button, it's not actually. Oh. Never moved from the first slide. So you can't just. Actually, I come on to opportunities and opportunities provided by technology, but obviously, oh, there we are. But before I go on to that, I also wanted to pay tribute to Gordon Conway, who was obviously known to many people here as well. And Gordon Conway, I think this was after he'd left ODA and had gone to head up Rockefeller. And he set up two organizations. I'm very privileged to have served on the board of both these organizations. He set them up as charities. They're both actually UK charities. They're very different. Well, in Rockefeller, so at the time, he got money also from the Gates Foundation, and both of them are highly dependent on Gates Foundation funding to this day. GovMed, which is the Global Alliance for Livestock Veterinary Medicine, is based in Edinburgh and has strong links to the commercial sector. Again, just trying to make the point that if you're looking at livestock vaccines, there's a huge market. There's a lot of commercial people involved in that. And therefore, maybe basing it in Edinburgh was the place for, or basing it in the UK, rather was a place to go, and it still has commercial people with commercial backgrounds on the board. On the other hand, AATF, the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, which is actually formed a couple of years, it's now 23 years old, I think. It's based in Nairobi. And right from the start in the Constitution, it had to have an African CEO and an African chair. I think that was an important part of it. I'll come back to that later. Having it as a UK charity is a bit of a nightmare, however, as I'm discovering, because Niger, as soon as you say you have a subsidiary in Nigeria, you're under the cosh in terms of auditing and stuff like. So there are differences between them. But I thought the foresight to set up charities at that point and that they kept going for so long. They need to keep going into the future. There's something else. As you know, Bill Gates is changing the way he's funding things, looking for sustainability, not wanting to fund these forever, but very good idea from the start. So scaling up, and I like the term, but I thought I'll look up what it actually means when you look for the definition. And I thought it was quite, I never really thought about it in the same way. Scaling, taking the scales off a fish, for example, removing a barrier to consumption, and to climb up a steep surface, to scale a hill or whatever. And so it does make you think that a lot of scaling, and seeing whether scaling is going to happen, is to do with removing barriers. First identify the barriers, and then remove them. So what are those barriers? I don't know if any of you have come across this report, which was from AGRA. It was published in 2024. And the first and the last chapters, I think, Tom Reardon, some of you may know, an economist, very good economist from the US, worked a lot in LMICs. And basically, that report, it wasn't long, came out not long after I had come back into FCDO, and it was making it really clear that the agri-food sector in Africa is changing very fast. Changing a lot in terms of processed food. a lot of jobs. So he's got something like 20 to 25% of rural jobs in sub-Saharan Africa come from the processing sector. 39% they come from farm wages. It's a huge, and then there's another bit which is about farm ownership. It's a very, very fast moving opportunity. And a lot of people on farms, a lot of the processing is taking place in rural areas. So therefore it also provides an income for farmers, and talks a lot about small, medium-sized enterprises. So why acceleration? I had to think myself why I had used that word acceleration. It is a word that is used quite a bit at the moment. I spend some time on Science Oversight Committee, something called the Accelerator Programme on enteric fermentation, which is basically about methane from cows and how to accelerate research on that. You also see, it's from later on, I'm also showing you another program called Aim for Scale, which also has that concept of acceleration. Why do we need acceleration? The challenges, wicked problems, sectors, everything. You can't, as we had, if you go back to the RNRS, crop protection, livestock production, animal health, they were all parallel lines. We didn't really do very much together. But, of course, talked about the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. And the people who are passionate about the Sustainable Development Goals talk about them as a package. And that's how they were developed. This is a package. All 17 of them have to be delivered simultaneously. Well, it's not possible because you increase one, you decrease another, etc. That's, in a sense, a wicked problem if we're trying to achieve this. And we need to do our research differently. Mission research differently from having all these parallel lines. And as I said, I did some reviewing for the GCRF, Global Research Challenges Programme. It used to, not quite make me weep, but I would certainly grimace when I read all these proposals that said, we are going to make a significant contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I thought, for £200,000, you're actually going to have an impact on that? No. So again, it's the culture of people on both sides of commissioning and delivery, understanding what's feasible in research and thinking about impact at a certain level. Okay, so that was the first challenge, climate change. I'm sure I don't need to say anything about that. Here we are, heat waves, record temperatures, etc., extremes. And I surely either have to say anything about geopolitical threats with wars and tariffs. We saw with Ukraine, and we've seen it again with the Gulf in terms of what these things can actually, what wars can do in terms of disrupting trade. It's a very important part of the agri-food system. Disease threats, well, climate change adds to that, but so does our traveling around the world. And then budget realities. Well, I haven't said too, and I don't want to say too much, but February last year, 40% cut in the aid budget. So we have to be nimble, but these are the challenges. However, look at the opportunities. And that goes back to what I was saying about my opponent's colleague. He was saying, no, we don't need any more biological research. It's all there. Really? Look at all of that. It's not agriculture research. It has come from EPSRC and the research councils, etc. It's come from other research councils. And basically what it's saying is we need to be more joined up. Now, I can assure you, I don't know a lot about any of these, but that one in the middle, also loop diagrams, I'm very fond of. Because the institute that I was director of in Scotland was the Macaulay Institute at the time, but it actually has experts. It's now the James Hutton Institute. They have experts in these causal loop diagrams. This looks complicated, but this came from a paper, you see the reference there, where they had done a systematic review of all the literature on migration and what impacts it. And if you look up on the top, one of the big things that has, so all those arrows, you can see arrows with a head going into migration or arrows with a head going back to food security. These are all the links. And food security is big up there, and so are livelihoods, which were a very important part of DFID research in the Yellow Brick and afterwards. So what this is a tool. I couldn't tell you how this was done. I can't create, I have had a tutorial on how to create these diagrams, but they enable us to go through those hundreds of research papers, all that knowledge that's out there. They actually enable people that can do this to draw on that and pull it together and tell you how one thing influences another. They also help you identify the barriers to scaling up. However, there's not many people that can do this, and this sort of diagram up there, because they don't understand it. But actually, I brought one of my former colleagues from the James Hutton Institute to a small workshop where we were talking about methane. And methane in cattle is also very complicated. And we tried to draw a diagram. Of course, we couldn't complete it. We didn't have the numbers. But they were very impressed by it, made them think. Made them think what things are connected, what influences what. And I think that is important in this day and age. So, examples of what has changed over the years. So as I did say, I was going to compare the 1990s to the 2020s. So I was very fortunate last year. I spent 3 weeks in Africa, 2 weeks, a week and a half in Kenya, and a week and a half in Kigali, in Rwanda. And I was in Rwanda for this conference, the African Conference on Agricultural Technologies, ACAT 2025. And ACAT was set up by AETF, which was the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, set up by Gordon Conway. And basically, they see themselves as a platform working pan-Africa to try and a lot of what they do is working with policy. I mentioned earlier about GMOs, and African governments, African populations, anti-GMOs, because frankly, the EU, one of the reasons is the EU dumped, and the US dumped a lot of GMO. When there was a famine, they would dump GMO, without asking about leave, they just dumped GMO food in some of these countries, and they didn't like being told that this is what they had to eat. Anyway, so ATF concentrates quite a lot on GMO crops and getting them scaled up. They're not just GMO crops. This conference I found inspiring. February 2025 was when the cuts came. Imagine what FCDO was like and the development bits at the time. It's been a negativity around huge cuts. Where was aid going? The CRD ceased to exist, etc. I went to this conference and they were all really positive. Africa, were 800 people there. 90% of them were African. And basically, and there were 5 governments represented. They see food sector, the agri-food sector, as $1 trillion business that they want to grow forever. You see, Africa has potential to feed the world and grow its own economy as it actually does it. So that is a change that they were taking the leadership. They were happy. They said, okay, so there's cuts in aid, but that means we can make the choice. It's not a minister in the UK government or in the US that decides what the money goes on, research, innovation, etc. We will be more in control. CGIAR, it's largely been looking at the breeding side, developing the technologies, but in its latest incarnation, it has set up this scaling program. scaling for S4I is what they're shortening it to. And basically, they are looking to, it was built from something like ATF used to be a member of TAAT, Technologies for Agricultural Transformation, which was set up with the African Development Bank. And another change is that the development banks are starting to more investment in scaling up technologies. And in fact, at the ACAT meeting in Kigali, there was someone from the National Bank of Rwanda there, and he committed in front of the 800 delegates that he was going to make sure that 30% of his loans went to agriculture. Now, Rwanda's a small country, so we're not talking huge scaling here, but it's just, if you get the investment, then that's important. Now, aim for scale is another one, and it's one that talks about acceleration as well. Aim for scale was announced at COP28. How many of us think these COPs, nothing really comes out of them? Lots of people that go, but what happens? Well, the global methane program I work on came out of COP26 in Glasgow, and Aim for Scale came out of COP28, which I think was in UAE. And basically, UAE have a lot of money, and they are got interest in investing in African agriculture because they're trying to be able to grow all their own food. And therefore, they are working closely with the Gates Foundation. So what does Aim for Scale do? Basically, it's about coming up with a package of innovations that countries can then take to the development banks to get money for investment, loans and grants. So again, it's research, but it's research that's recognizing that scaling is going to need money. There's philanthropy behind it, but we also need to have the governments and the changes in policies. So the objective of Aim for Scale, accelerating that, innovation packages, that is evidence-based packages of what would work for the scaling. And then we think about the technical design, financing mechanisms, etc. So new instruments, if you like, are helping the scaling. And then one that has been funded by my colleagues in FCDO, this is all in the out in the public domain. It was started possibly 4 years ago, and it was collaboration between Innovate UK and Innovate UK have an arm called Business Connect, and they were delivering this for us, but it was bringing together actually Brazil and Africa. And I went to one of their sort of meetings at the end of the first phase. I was very impressed by the number of small-scale innovators from the UK who had been introduced to markets in Africa. And they had learnt from having Brazilians also there. So these were people that might have been developing weather forecasting, for example. Digital weather forecasting is a big thing at the moment. And so, again, a different sort of mechanism than we've had in the past, where you're trying to bring together financial opportunities to try and accelerate some of the technologies. And then this one was just launched on the 18th of May. And this is the new research program for FCDO. It's called GRTD, Global Research and Technology Development. And you can go to the website to look into it in detail. But basically, it's doing what we've seen this trajectory, no longer parallel programs, but programs actually working together across disciplines, across various sectors. And 13 thematic areas, food systems very much still in there, but food systems. We're not talking agriculture, we've moved into food systems or agri-food systems. Okay, so I said it was going to be a personal reflection. I had to say that because I'm not speaking about CGO, just to remind you in terms of all of that. So where is this taken me? So what needs to be different in the 2020s? And a big thing I've learned from being on the AETF board, I used to being on boards and I don't mind saying else. But actually, I thought I would show a couple of photos here. And this is a photo of the Ilry board back in the early 2000s. Mostly white. The people that are actually looking after the animals there. And those were, and I move on to the ATF. Oops, sorry, I'm too far now. AATF, the top decision makers on AATF. Here we are, with someone from Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Cameroon. They're the ones making the decisions. I'm on the board, but I am very much respectful. I don't know. I'm on board. They need someone from the UK to satisfy UK Charities Commission that they have an address in the UK. That's a huge change. Back to what I was saying before, that we really need to have people on the continent in the know that are the ones that are taking the decisions. So basically, what are these other points that need to be different? Markets. To me, it's very clear from looking at where scaling has been successful that you have to have the supply and demand. And even now, within FCDO, I look at presentations from my economics colleagues, and they're looking at the market side, but they're not looking at the supply side at all. And so I challenged them and said, hey, come on, we've got to do this together. And particularly if you think we're doing, there's a lot of work going on healthy diets, healthy components of diets, and working with school children, for example, to get them used to that we want to eat healthier diets, more fruit and veg, for example. And what's the point if there's no supply? So again, it's important to actually have affordable supply in the research angle alongside the demand. Also, going back to when I started, it was, farmers are the only ones you need to talk to. No longer. It's also thinking about all these other barriers from policymakers, from access to finance, etc., etc. You need to engage with a range of stakeholders. And then finally, investment options. And in my reading of this, is very much trying to sort out, is this a public good? Is this something the government is actually going to subsidize? Is government going to put money into help this? So, for example, environment, can't expect farmers, even in this country, well, DEFRA is putting money in to help environmental benefits from farming in the UK, and it's the same, sorting out where do you need public investment, where do you need private investment. Then infrastructure. I mentioned that Tom Reardon, and that to me is really clear. Some countries in Africa, we talk about Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, some countries invest in infrastructure, roads, markets, etc. Some don't. Can we sort of ensure where we're trying to increase agri-food or increase the contribution of the agri-food system to the overall economy, is going to need to be investment in that infrastructure. And then I had to put this one in at the end of the road. Ideally, I thought, I know, I just showed longer term funding for government doesn't happen. We have no control over that. Might going to change again. You notice we have a change of prime minister. But really, can we find ways of helping to ensure that there is longer term funding in those government departments? So, coming to an end. Thank you. I've learned a lot from all my colleagues over the years, but I also added one at the bottom here. But actually, I've had a great career because I got recognition for what I did to start with, because they needed women on boards or on various things. I've been told that to my face enough times to know that's absolutely true. So that was good. That kept me right while I was there. There were a lot of women that inspired me, ahead of me, who didn't get any of that recognition. So I just wanted to add them to the thank yous. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Very, very thought-provoking, and I'm myself in critical. Well, we have an audience online and an audience here. I'm sure you're all bursting with questions and points you'd like to raise or thoughts that Maggie's provoked in you. I hope we can hear the people online. Is that going to happen, Matt? Okay. So perhaps if you can raise your hand or put something in the chat so we can see your questions from there as well. I have to come down to Maggie. Well, I'm stuck on this. Okay, the questions from the floor here to start with. I'll press this.
Hello, yeah. I was interested in the point you made about processing. I was really quite interested in that because one of the problems I used to see in Africa was, you know, primary production of commodities for export abroad, and very little processing being done in countries, and you start adding value. So, is that processing being done for the home market, or for export, or both? That's what it is. How can I hear that? But it's one of the more detail.
Yeah, it's very interesting question. What Tom Reardon was.
Oh, sorry, that's me. Sorry.
What Tom Reardon. That's still there? Yeah. What Tom Reardon was, what he was making, which horrified me a bit, is that actually the consumption of ultra-processed food is going up fastest in Africa, which is a negative.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he has data about the, so I was looking for the number again today, and I thought it was something like the number of smallholder farmers whose full income is coming from the farm has dropped a lot.
Why?
Because a lot of processing is happening in rural areas, and he had medium and small enterprises, and had another one as well added into that. And it's mostly for the domestic market. So you're getting supermarkets in some countries, but of course it's not across the whole world in that sense. But it's providing jobs. If they're doing it in rural areas, it's providing jobs for people who are living on farms as well.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know. Is this a short-term positive for economic growth, but negative in terms of health in the longer term? Not about confidence of speech.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
You mentioned right the importance of infrastructure, and you're just talking back to last year's lecture, Memorial Lecture, on Ken Gill, the sort of a throwaway remark that people increased maize yield in Africa from 1 ton per hectare to 5 ton per hectare, purely by increasing the amount of fertilizer used. Now, the constraint of fertilizer is infrastructure, because the costs are much higher in Africa than anywhere else in the world. So I'm assessing maybe that's a single more necessary but not sufficient condition. It's obviously incredibly difficult when you're talking about huge capital investment in roads, railways and ports.
Maggie, sorry, could you summarise the question again? Because it wasn't. Thank you.
Right. So the question was about infrastructure, referring back to last year's lecture by Ken Gill, who's talking about the fastest way to increase yield is by using fertilizer. And when I first started with NRI, I was going to increase productivity of animals by feeding them concentrates. Anyway, you can't, so you have to, I think it was too often. I mean, how many smallholder farmers are there? Something like 2 billion across the world. And the thing is, they're not all. TAAI used to have this hanging in and stepping up all the time. Remember those livelihood things that they actually talked about? I think we need to think about which farmers have got the potential to commercialise them. And actually, one of the facts that I learned with some people was that the amount of money that flows back as remittances to the LMICs is actually a lot higher than the amount of aid money. And that money is going back. Now, I also watched a webinar for IFA, they were having so they're having a webinar about the use of that money in rural areas. I think they have a year where it is the year of the rural remittances. When you start to look into it, because I was looking at migration a few weeks ago, and if you look at one of the benefits of migration on a certain category of migrants is some of them are going to earn money to go back and then by buying fertilizer, buying new seeds, etc., and getting their productivity increased that way. A lot of them are also learning. They go and work in farms. If you look at, I think it's Morocco to Spain, it's one of the areas where Moroccans go to Spain, they learn by working in the fields, they go back and adapt the technique. So there's a lot of these things going on, which are nothing to do with aid budgets, development, or research. So yes, you've got to tailor what you do to the sorts of farmers you're trying to actually help and contribute. I would say it's one to sort of, if you want to grow the economy of these countries to start it off, then it is the commercial asset, where there's potential for commercialization, you can buy some of those inputs. But fertilizers, as we've all seen, it is a huge risk.
Thank you. Very.
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself so the people online can hear?
Ian Lane, freelance consultant, actively retired. Thank you, Maggie. That was very challenging. Could you say something about on-farm research, and particularly farmer-led on-farm research, possibly with support of people like Gabriella?
Yes, that was something on farm research. It sort of comes and goes, gets talked about as action research, etc. We actually fund some interesting projects with Maggie. And I've attended some meetings where Maggie have presented, where part of what they're doing is actually training up agri-processors. So, and those agri-processors, it's training up agri-service providers. That's the phrase that I want. And there was a really inspiring talk by a young lady who was from Uganda, and she had gone on one of these training courses and was going around farms, and of course she gets the feed, so she's got that connection. So it's not on-farm research by researchers, it's on-farm research by getting the data and that feedback going to from people like the extension services, etc. So yes, it's going on. I feel I'm not sure I think that would be on certainly in that same sort of space of trying to understand that the sorts of knowledge exchanges.
Right, Maggie, can we take a question from David Howlett? David?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, lovely to hear you from Maggie, and it's been ages. Lots of memories flooded back. One key thing, I remember having to brief Hilary Benn when we're getting rid of the yellow brick and going to research use, how to handle all these angry leads and professors in the atrium of Palace Street. So it brought back lots of memories. But my question is, one thing which I found perhaps missing is the existential threat of climate change to agriculture and food security, which is going to, I'm now focusing more on the UK, having worked for the climate champions on rural, urban issues for the last few years. But it's really going to radically change agriculture, and some farmers, their lives are going to go. So how is, what's your thinking on that? And also, is FCO I know there's lots of stuff on the ICF funding on climate, but what about climate change? It didn't really come across a lot in what was an excellent presentation. Thanks, Maggie.
Very much.
I'm sorry I
Yeah,
can't be
no,
with you in London. I'm up in North Yorkshire.
right. Hopefully it's cooler up there. So why did I not talk a lot about climate change? I presume you all knew about climate change, especially on a day like this in London. Do we do things on climate change? Yes. Climate change then comes to, and in fact, if you look at, I think in the GRTD, let's keep stopping and thinking what that acronym's for, but our new Global Research and Technology Development Research Programme has, so there is a climate, there's a climate section in that, and we have a climate, like we have a food and agriculture group, that a research group I'm part of. There's also a climate, there's a lot on climate and nature there as well. So adaptation versus mitigation is a big topic and a big topic for discussion. You know, how much, and as I said, I do some work with the Global Methane Hub, which is trying to decrease livestock emissions of methane. And we are funding some work in elements, but we're funding actually on genetics, because it is heritable. You can actually separate high and low methane emitters. And one of the ways of going forward on that, so the Global Methane Hub has actually, through VESOS, the VESOS Earth Fund, which has got billions, you know. Anyway, they are funding mitigation. When you start to look at what do you do in Africa, I looked at it, if you increase productivity, if you stop the animals dying, you actually reduce emissions per kilo of product. But what is more urgent? So yes, there are some things we need to do, but what is more urgent is the whole adaptation in response to, you know, how can we help these countries adapt to these extreme weather? And there is quite a lot on that, but there's billions going in on climate research. So, you know, it's how much do we need to add into that? Do you want another one online or?
Do one and then do one online.
Thanks, Maggie. Andy Ward from Prof Life International, and many thanks for first employing me at NR International back in 1999 for their Deep Crop Protection Program. Yeah, a couple of things. Firstly, to reinforce what you said about migration. Did some work in Central America recently, and there was actually a boost in Central America from some of the Donald Trump immigration policies, that people were returning and were bringing knowledge, and there was some anecdotal, but there appeared to be a bit of a boost to the rural economy. Then secondly, last year, TAAI organised a conference on biologicals in tropical agricultural systems at Rothamsted. And one of the areas of discussion that we had there was on registration of biologicals, and yeah, some different opinions there. You didn't cover regulatory issues so much in this, I guess probably falls under the infrastructure question. But I suppose I'm quite aware that having good regulatory guidelines really helps with the facilitation and promotion of technical innovation. But that in itself is another of these areas where Westerners like to interfere. I mean, let's not point any fingers. There are NGOs, there are private sector, there are different interest groups interfering there. And how do we work to get regulation, or how do we enable indigenous regulators to develop that regulatory environment which really works for the intended people rather than the politics and the biases of outsiders?
Thanks, and it's a good question. And actually, usually, I talk quite a bit about regulation, but I missed my thoughts, which came through. So AATF, I did mention that they talked policy quite a lot. And with government, what government's really good at is with their development, so they're trying to scale up vaccine use. And government has someone who's working on the policy side, trying to get regional agreements on some of these regulations, rather than every African country having its own regulation on vaccines and that sort of, and the same with GMOs. It is very important, and one lesson I learned from the TAA was, so Nigeria has accepted GM seeds. So has South Africa, but seeds had to be multiplied in South Africa, sent up to Nigeria, and they got held up at customs and missed the season. And it's that sort of mapping these things out on a pathway as to what are some of the things. It's not just one regulation. You have to understand all of the different sort of types of regulation that are going to. So it is very important, and for, to some extent, the likes of CADEC, I'm sure people are familiar with CADEC and all these African Union organizations that are trying to get agreement across the continent. Another thing I have, we talk about the continent all the time, which keeps reminding me of Europe, and when Europe is starting to get together. There's a real sense of trying to get the African continent working together. It's like Europe working together in the past. And if we did, then, many complain about European regulations and so on and so forth. You've got to get the balance. But it took a lot of time if you didn't have a regulation in each country, basically. Right, another one online. Jim, do you want to read it out, Jim, your question? So we can't hear you, but...
He's probably got his
Okay, well...
loudspeaker off.
I think if you read it.
Okay. With new generations of researchers, is there still a tendency to be rather top down, at least as far as farmers and consumers, who have little real and economic voice? Jim thinks this might still be the case. Are incentives for researchers always right? Oh, actually, have we closed mute? No, for everybody. It's not us. And do some of the old lessons still have relevant? Yeah, it's a good question. Is it? I don't know. I thought one of the things GCRF potentially did was that with some of those partnerships between UK researchers and partners in country, well, actually the UK researchers learned a bit more about not being top down. So I thought there was a positive, and partly, if I recall correctly, well, when we were looking at the GCRF proposals, some of them, if you had an international conference, or even if you had a conference in Zimbabwe and you had people in Kenya and Uganda, you still sent the Brit to the conference in Zimbabwe. And we used to come down heavily on that and say, actually, this is about South-South. Let these people experience the regional opportunities and meet their colleagues and be able to develop in that way. So you can actually change it. How much has it changed? I don't know. It's each time there's a change in the funding and things, the culture changes again. Yeah, maybe I should do this with Holly. Who else was good?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm doing the same as the executive committee to TAA. I'm part of the executive committee at TAA, but I'm also one of the PAO, recently in the past, many years in the field. And I wanted to pick up 2 points that genuinely actually people into this dimension of working in the development of this awareness and investing not Africa states of the poorer essential research linkages, and so trying to see how better to serve producers and their organizations through that. And I just want to pick up 2 points in this words, actually, which are very important, which is, are the incentives now there for researchers to listen and to respond to the voice of consumers and producers? Because this was has been a critical problem since the 1990s, since the war. And we didn't hear much from you or experience on that.
Thanks. On the incentives there, I mean, I guess I'm not involved in the UK research community as much as to be able to sort of in terms of whether the African researchers or the CG researchers that I meet with, I think there's still some way to go. And I think, so I often say to people that one of the things I really admired about DFID, and I think it was maybe when it's in the night, when it's still ODA, but it was also probably the semester life before. I remember attending a festival of failures. And it was a lot of people getting together who were prepared to actually say, the big failure I remember is a guy who was setting up refugee camps. And a guy was setting up refugee camps. And he set the women's toilets on the edge of the camp. And they didn't get used because of security concerns that they went there. He admitted that. And to me, that has been that DFID has been prepared to actually learn from those failures. When we were privatized and from one day to the next, we suddenly got dumped into a university, I was flabbergasted when we had the rudeness of the emails. I was just the competition, not the person, you want to be the professor, you want to be the big bird, you want to be this. So, and most of my career, my career was in research, was in research institutes, and that was a much better atmosphere. You were not being pushed to have these impact factors. And if you look at, so what are the incentives for individuals in research are these, the REF, the Research Excellence Framework that every 5 years or whatever it is, they get some of their money by competing against each other. And the incentives for that is knock out everybody else so get as much. And even though they brought impact in, it wasn't the impact. I had a big row with the professor from Edinburgh University. He told me, I said, well, impact in development is different from impact in universities. And he told me that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard me say. When I got this view, but it's still my view, but actually what it counts as impact in the rent is very different from what we're talking about here. So are the incentives right? No. Well, some cases they are.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. This is David Ralph, if I'm retired these days. Just a general, do you want to comment on the health international architecture for agricultural research? We've got CGIAR, which is supposed to look with national agricultural research systems.
We've got GFAR, which is another player which you didn't mention, which is supposed to make some of those links. We've got the African regional and sub-regional research organisations, which are supposed to act as a conduit to strengthen the capacity of African researchers. Would you just like to make a few general comments on that?
I'm not sure whether to ask for the recording to turn off. So, my understanding, when I first was going to join, when I tried to join OEA back in the 70s, and part of it in terms of research was we do ourselves out of job because we were handing over to people in countries. And my understanding of the CG was that they were going to hand over they were going to be there for a set period of time, and then it's going to be that international research would happen with the countries, international countries working together. Could the system work without CG at the moment? The CG, as you've seen, has a huge impact, but they could do better, and I'm on record for this, so it's not. They could do better at recognising their partners because they work with partners. But I said to someone who works in CG last year, I said, what is it like going to the field with a partner from anonymous who's paid very low salary relative to your salary in terms of this? Are they happy to work with you? And that's it. And I think that works. And I don't think that's right. Now, some of these other organisations, FAO, GFAR, IFAD, they have a specific, I think it's, if I was in charge, which of course I'm not, but if one was sort of, I would spend more time working out what are the unique selling points of these different organisations. And I go back to AATF, who were set up to do that translation. And they now have the CG moving into that space. They have other people moving into that space. And I say to them, look, work out what is it that you, as an African organisation, with your, what is it you can do that international people coming in can't do? And there are some things, because the CG can have an influence at higher levels than many of these other organisations. So we need these, but there is no one in the world, no organisation that will get that overall architecture mapped out. Nobody could do it. So, I don't know, it's just trying to make everybody think, what is your unique selling point? What are you bringing to the party in terms of this? You have a question from Andrew. Funds are inevitably short. Where do you think international funding for research should focus? Partnerships, regional, international systems, meetings. Yeah. I don't know. What are the priorities? We do talk quite a lot about priorities within FCDO. I mean, partners, it's great to have partners, but you're adding another dimension then into, like, we work a lot with games in FCDO, and in fact, also with, well, ALTF and ProgMed, as I said, was also funded by Gates. And Gates, as you know, as Bill Gates sort of takes a decision and comes down through the ranks in terms of, and it's his view on it. It's, you have to choose partners that you can negotiate with, that you can have a common objective with. Where would I put my money in the moment? I would, as I try to sort of bring out in the end, I'd be looking more for finance. How do you work with the people who are going to make the scaling more sustainable in the longer term? And as I said, some of that is private sector, some of it is public sector. Throughout my career, where I've been involved in commissioning or employing strategies drawing up strategies for research, it's always been a question, how much, I think, probably Andrew, you and I had discussions on this a long time ago about how much goes on upstream, downstream, what was appropriate for an RNRS program. 20% upstream, 80% downstream. There's no right answer in terms of any of that. It has to be doing things and really monitoring, evaluating, learning. We moved from M&E to Mel quite a few years ago, and that's that learning that's absolutely key. What works, what doesn't work, and make the adjustments. But as we know, governments don't always know that.
Back as well, Maggie. Jim.
Jim Ellis Stones, originally from Zimbabwe. I used to manage a subsection of the NRSP called Hillsides Program once. I'm part of Mexico. In your presentation, you didn't say very much about the extension side of things. You answered my question partly just now, but we went through a phase of, which I didn't hear you mention, but stakeholder platforms, how to link the research better with farmers. The Hillsides program was just certainly 80% downstream, trying to sort of look at that. But I wondered, what attention has that received? We see in Uganda efforts to privatize the extension services. I think Ethiopia is the only country that's actually met the targets in terms of funding extension programs with many programs. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, well, having lived through, the changes in ADAS here, for example, maybe extension services are, maybe we need a different terminology in terms of that. What I've been most impressed by recently has been the work of Cabby, while they were working with agri-service providers and working with people from so you've got companies, pesticide companies that will go and sell at their push go market and push on the same as fertilizers and all these different things. And how do you get how do you get the messages you want to cross rather than the marketing messages they want to actually do? And what was that? There was something set up in about 2011, 12. Go down.
Oh yes,
Go down. And go down. I remember being asked something, I don't know, something like 20. It was a big conference. It was about data, global data sharing. And I remember being passed something like 20 proposals and told to judge which one should be presented at the conference in like 3-minute slots or whatever else. It was a huge thing about people that were good at digital or IT read up about agriculture and thought they could be extension services and they could really push it. It was horrific. And it sort of disappeared out of sight, luckily, at some point in time. But there is still a lot of digital agriculture is out there big time. And you look at the numbers that they say that they're reaching in terms of farmers. And then you hear, so they're talking about farmers having mobile phones, because that's, they send them forecasts or they send them all sorts of things to the mobile phones. And then you come across a figure that says only 23% of farmers, smallholder farmers in Nigeria have access to a phone. So it's very hard. And recently I saw something where they were saying we reached 90% of wheat farmers or something in a country I looked up. It didn't grow much wheat. So there weren't actually many farmers, 90% of that. And a lot of those, where they were quoting percentages, are actually percentages of the people they can reach. It doesn't tell you about how many people Paddy can reach. So I'm skeptical about a lot of these. It's going to happen if for scale have a big program on digital agriculture and that whole sort of extension side of things. The Cabby working with companies, I think that's a really good way to go, because then you're feeding back into the country the risks of pesticides and things like that. So there's no silver bullet in any of this. There's no right or wrong. Depends on the country, depends on mobile signals, depends on farmer efficiency. And of course, it's all changing so fast. And it's a question at the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. My name's Ruth Mallison. I'm a freelance consultant and worked a lot with smallholder agriculture, this farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. And you mentioned ultra-processed food and how that's increasing. And I thought it was interesting your comments on scaling up. But from my recent work on scaling up, the focus has been on what I would call the path of least resistance. So the crops such as maize, wheat, and rice, which respond to fertilizer, and the nitrogen fertilizer respond to huge amounts of water, and are really lucrative for the agricultural input industry. And there's a tension there. You mentioned, though, that adaptation is what's really important. And from my work with smallholder farmers, they're farming millets and they're farming sorghum, which are much more resistant to problems with water. They're less responsive to nitrogen fertilizer. So what is your view on what can be done in that area, in relation to funding? Because I strongly feel that this is a very important area. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge, a lot of important crop varieties, which will be lost because of the balance of power and the fact that there is a lot of investment being put into more high input value.
Thanks. There have been quite a lot of, so rather being called neglected crops, orphan crops, etc. I mean, it's easy. I showed you the figures from CGIAR. It's easy to, everybody eats wheat. Not everybody eats millet, not everybody eats sorghum. And this goes back to they are getting more attention. And I think in the current framework, CG framework, there's a lot more work going on with the NARS. So in the past, the CG took breeding programs within the centres themselves, and there's a lot more going on, training up people and partnerships with breeding organisations within the countries. And I think that will then also help to take it out to those other parts. It doesn't get this high profile, but then it's not the same. It's not everywhere. Not everywhere goes sorghum, not everywhere goes millet. But it's just getting attention. It's just, it's like, I agree with you. And I think to some extent, when you've got large companies that are getting money out of it, maize, rice, the main staples, rice government money or philanthropy money, needs going into, you can see economic growth benefits to the UK, worldwide goes with it. As I said, I'm just an advisor by the decisions and I aren't fair CDO.
I think, Maggie and audience, if you'll forgive me, I think we probably better wrap it up because I'm keeping people here from food and drink, it's always dangerous to do. But fantastic talk and question and answer session. Thank you so much, Maggie. And I think it's highlighted so many of the issues that it's really the other one that I didn't see here is how do we actually get institutions to work together? They're very good at protecting themselves, defending themselves, justifying themselves. They're nowhere near as good at working together and actually making these connections happen. And I think the same applies in government departments, as you highlighted, in developing countries as well, that they're defending their own turf often, rather than looking how they invest together to make less things happen. So a policy change at the way we think about organisation as much as it is a technical issue, which you're raising on those many infrastructure issues. But thank you so much. I think we all owe you a big debt of gratitude for the last couple of hours. Thank you so much.